innate, then it's not really an assumption because you couldn't think otherwise.
Oh, what makes it an assumption is that you can't justify it. You have to just assume it. There's no way to justify it.
Well,
it's not
really?
whether it's innate or not.
Is there any way to justify anything in your worldview?
Well, I think some things can be justified better than others.
No, I didn't ask you qualitatively better. I said, in your worldview, do you have the capacity to verify or justify that something is the case?
I think I hold all my beliefs tentatively, but I still feel comfortable saying that I know some true things. Probably not nearly as many as you. But I think that we have to live sort of probabilistically and provisionally, and be ready to revise our beliefs if we're faced with evidence or an argument.
How do you have a probabilistic assessment in a world where just stuff happens?
You assume the laws of nature are regular.
Oh, so you are believing that nature operates in some law-like ways without rational justification?
That's right. That's what it means to say it's assumed.
Oh, okay. Okay, so let me ask you
I'm going to have
question.
to refresh. I'll be right back because you're turning into a robot. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, that's what I mean by it's an assumption. It's something we have to assume without any justification in order to proceed with some of the other things. Unless it conflicts with some other beliefs and makes those beliefs untenable, or some kind of evidence shows that it was a bad assumption, I just have to kind of live provisionally assuming it.
Now, are you the kind of atheist that denies the existence of God, or you just have a lack of belief?
I think some gods, I think, are impossible the way they're defined. And other gods, I say, well, I guess that's possible.
Okay, so would you say that you either deny in some cases or withhold belief because they're not rationally justified?
No, it's probably not really. You mean because an argument for their existence isn't rationally justified? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, if you withhold belief in X, and X is God or the ultimacy of reality, you withhold belief because it hasn't been rationally justified. Would you believe in God if God was rationally justified to you?
I'm not sure, to be honest, if just rationally justified would be enough if we're talking about the Christian God, because I have a lot of issues with.
What else would you include other than rational justification in order to believe something?
Empirical evidence.
Yeah, but empirical evidence doesn't speak for itself. You would have to rationally justify that which is evidence.
Well, I would have to interpret it as evidence.
What it all comes down to is a rational justification. So in order to believe in God, we require rational justification. It's not a very controversial question.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if I agree with that, but I'd be fine to go along with it to hear where you're gonna go next.
Well, you brought up evidence. What's your rational justification that evidence is meaningful?
Meaningful?
Yeah, you brought up evidence a number of times, that you need evidence for things. Evidence means that there is a cause and effect relationship between some events. Now, what's your rational justification that there are causal connections? Because without causal connections, one cannot speak in a metaphysically intelligible way about evidence.
Right. So I assume that induction is a worthwhile way to think. But I have to admit it's a tentative assumption because it's always possible the sun won't rise or something, and we'd all have to revamp our whole way of approaching problems. So if I see a piece of evidence that I call it evidence if it increases the likelihood that some theory I've got in my head is true.
No, you're missing my question. What is your rational justification that there are causal connections between events?
That's an assumption.
Oh, so you don't have a basis for evidence then?
No, I don't think that that's got to do with whether or not I count something as evidence. You asked me. Go ahead.
Do you think that there's evidence for things by blind faith?
No, I think that a piece of evidence for something increases the likelihood that the thing I'm thinking about is true or decreases that likelihood.
You're missing my point. I'm not talking about a specification of evidence here or there. I'm talking about the concept of evidence. Now,
the concept of evidence is that
evidence. Can I finish my statement, please?
Sure.
Is the concept of evidence viable in virtue that it's rationally justified, or is it not rationally justified?
I'm not trying to be difficult, I promise. I don't know what you mean by evidence being rationally justified. Do you mean that I can justify what I'm claiming the evidence is showing me?
Well, you invoked evidence as a viable concept in your worldview. I want to see if your worldview can account for that. You see, you want God to be accounted for. So if you hold to a nature of reality from which you reason, such as the external physical world, causality, and laws of nature, I mean, that would probably seem to be what your ultimate commitment would be, the ultimacy of reality. So what would be the basis for you to assert that there is causality? What would be your rationale for that? Because surely, since you want a rationale for God, then what's your rationale for that?
Well, look, I don't necessarily want a rationale for God. I'm okay with you believing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's just not the way I have.
Why don't you believe in God?
Okay, so what we were talking about with respect to evidence is connected to an assumption about induction, which is connected to an assumption that nature is basically regular. And so all of those things sort of are on like a balance, and they all sort of support one another. So if one of them goes...
Do they support each other with rational justification?
No, I think they support each other in a kind of a practical way, in a way that allows me to move through the world.
Practicality assumes the world works in a certain way. Do you know that the world works in a certain way?
The world works in a certain way. No, you mean like the uniformity of nature kind of thing?
No,
I think that's something. Yeah, all of those things. I don't think they're. I think that they're intertwined with other beliefs in a great big web kind of idea. And I do think some of them are more fundamental than others. Like,
why do you hold to them?
Well, because they allow me to move through the world, and I haven't had any bad luck not holding to them.
That's a form of circular reasoning. When you talk about moving through the world, you're introducing the concept of pragmatism. Pragmatism wouldn't be viable or meaningful if it didn't presuppose causality and the uniformity of nature. So,
well, that's what I'm saying. I do presuppose those things, just like you. Okay, I think we all do.
Okay, so why don't you presuppose God then?
So I think I'm understanding. For you, the existence of God is as unjustifiable as